Hello, mic test 1 2 3. Hello. ठीक है mic test. Hello, mic test 1 2 3.
Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to everyone here. Welcome to our session at IPRI. Today, I'm very happy and it's a pleasure to invite on a very short notice to one of my friends, Dr. Amar Malik. He's going to be talking about China Belt and Road Initiative, specifically looking at the entire project through data. And I think you guys have done the most extensive data on the CPEC project. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the CPEC project itself. CPEC project was launched officially in 2013. It was being in the works for quite a lot of time during General Musharraf era and even during the People's Party regime. Under the last government, the CPEC project was officially announced and launched. There is a lot of conversations around CPEC, specifically exact details, the terms and conditions, the money, and there was a lot of confusion. Specifically, I remember back in the days when I was working the government, there was always a question whether it was a loan, a grant come loan, aid, whatever it was. It took some time to realize actually the exact details on CPEC project. The project has gone through several stages back and forth, and it's one of the most important projects right now. But again, for the purpose of any research, without any data on CPEC and understanding exactly what it is, what are the terms and conditions, it's still very hard to gauge the efficacy and the impact of the CPEC project that it will have. So I'm very happy to actually have talked to Amar on this, and he actually will come back to thank you for that you approached us for the subject, that this is something that's worthy to take notice. So Amar Malika, I'll just briefly give his bio. Amar is a senior research associate scientist at Aid Data, where he leads the China's development finance program. His team develops pioneering methods such as tracking under-reporting financial flows, TUFF, methodology to track, analyze underreported financial flows from non-traditional donors to developing countries. He also previously worked at the World Bank, International Food Policy Research Institute, Pakistan's National Disaster Management Authority, and Standard Chartered Bank. He will be presenting his talk, and without a further ado, Amar, please.
So very glad to be here. Thank you for taking the time. What I thought I'll do today is, I've written, co-authored with 5 or 6 other people a new research report, which is, you'll see the title on the screen. It's called Banking on the Belt and Road. This is basically a survey or a primer on what the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is from a data lens. The reason why this is important, I think, and the reason why I wanted to be here today is we have, through this data set that I will talk to you, just scratched the surface of what is possible in terms of analytic work. And I hope that some of you, especially I'm looking at some of the younger folks in the room, will take the time to dig into some of these variables, some of this data, and reach your own conclusions about some of the things that Hussain was talking about, including, what is it loan? Is it, how much is loan? How much is grant? What is CPEC? There are 2 reasons why I'm here, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more about this program in a minute. 2 objectives to be here today for me. One, to introduce you to some of the high-level findings so that you can develop an understanding of how CPEC fits into the global map of the Belt and Road Initiative. What is Belt and Road? Why are the Chinese doing it? What impact is it having in other countries? What are some of the challenges that other countries are facing? What are the opportunities? Just so that we can draw better conclusions about what is likely to happen here. Second, as I said, I want to introduce to you this data set that we have. I'll share my screen and I'll show you, because I think it's an enormously wealthy resource that any of you can take on. I know many of you work on topics that might be relevant to aspects of this that I'm studying. We also have a lot of data on People's Liberation Army and what they've been doing as part of BRI. And all of our data and everything that I'm going to talk about is on our website, aiddata.org. So a little bit about what Aid Data is. We are based at a university called William and Mary. As I was talking to your colleagues today, William and Mary is the 2nd oldest university in the US after Harvard, and it is about 3 hours from Washington, D.C. It's the site close to what is called Jamestown, which is where the first Europeans landed in America when they first came and started picking up some conflict with Native Americans. So it's got a long and rich history. We are a research lab run and managed independently, but we are very much part of the university. And so this project, so you must be thinking, why do we do this work? Who's funding it? What's in it for us? And why am I here? So basically, you know that after the Second World War, there was a Bretton Woods system that was created, a set of institutions, including the World Bank, the Paris Club, IMF, etc., where the world's richest countries, mostly the Western countries, including US, Germany, France, Japan, etc., the G7, they created sort of a club which said that any funding that we provide to developing countries, we will report to each other. So we know if you're funding $10 million of health project in Ghana, France is funding it. The US should not do the same thing. They should be better coordinated. China has really picked up, as you know, development financing in the last 20 years, but they're not part of this club. And quite deliberately, I think they are staying away from it. And that means they are not reporting to anybody. They don't feel obligated to report. In the last couple of years, they've started putting out white papers which give ambitious goals and some numbers about what they want to do on the aid part of this. But a large part of what I'm going to talk about is the loans part that Hassan was talking about. So the objective was, this started as a bachelor's undergraduate student coming to his professor saying, "Sir, why don't we have this data on China?" And he said, "Well, let's start collecting it." So this small project, which then got funding from the National Science Foundation, some university funding, started becoming an annual thing where a bunch of students would go in the open source, try to collate information, use the OECD's criteria of how Paris Club does the reporting, and then said, okay, how does it look for China, so that you can compare apples to apples. So that's how it started in 2013. And now it's a massive effort. We have over 130 students working part-time for us at the university. William & Mary is a great university, so we get people from all over the world. I would say about a third of our students are native Chinese speakers, so that really helps get access to the resources, but we also do data collection in many languages. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to briefly talk to you about what this data set is and why we do this. So first of all, as I said, the purpose is to facilitate rigorous analysis and support evidence-based action. And I say this because you'll read in the international media, there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of assumptions, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of philosophical beliefs about what is China doing. This is debt trap diplomacy. This is this. People are talking out of conviction, out of faith. There is very little actual evidence. And that the reason I explained to you earlier was that there's a lack of data. So our objective at the end of the day is to bring more evidence to light and bring it out in a way that other people can replicate. So none of what I'm talking to you today is in my laptop. Everything is on the web. You can go in and look and replicate these tables, and you can make your own conclusions about it. So openness, open data sharing is very much part of the DNA. So let me explain to you what is the scope of this data set before I start talking about the findings. So it captures all official sector financial flows from China that align with the OECD criteria. OECD is an organization based in Paris where all the G7 countries actually report their financing. Criteria for ODA and OOF, that means development assistance. ODA is short for aid, and OOF is short for debt. So that includes many different instruments. Sometimes they would give grants, like the Gwadar airport is a grant. Don't have to pay back. It's like a gift. You give somebody a gift and they do it. There is also TA, or technical assistance. This is what USAID does. Say we'll give $20 million to Pakistan to do maternal and child health. They'll fly in experts from DC and so on. They do loans, export credits, debt forgiveness, rescheduling, the whole 9 yards. So data has now over 13,000 projects worth over $840 billion. And it literally covers all big regions of the world, one of which, of course, is ours. We have comprehensive coverage of all of these different sectors in which China is financing projects. There's no sector that we don't cover. It covers all low and middle income countries. And it covers not just Chinese government institutions, but also Chinese state-owned financial institutions. So we always hear about the big names, the CDBs and the EXIMs, which are policy banks. But increasingly in the last 10 years, there's now a whole host of Chinese lenders. In fact, we have captured over 330 Chinese entities that are participating in the BRI just as financiers, not implementation, just as financiers. So we have over 5,000 recipient and borrowing and implementation agencies. This includes organizations in developing countries, as well as here, this would include special purpose vehicles that are created, state-owned banks, and so on. And our data set that I'm hopefully going to spend the last 10, 15 minutes on has over 70 variables, which is where I hope that some of you will take the time to dig in, because there you will find a whole wealth of information about, how much is the project worth. So every row in the data is a project. How much is the project worth? What is the implementation status? When was it supposed to start the construction? When was it supposed to end? Where is it delayed? Is it not delayed? Where is the project located? We also have maps. We can show you exactly where many of these projects are. How much is the interest rate if it's a loan? What is the maturity, grace period, all of those financial details. Because it's like loans are pretty simple. It's an interest rate and you have to pay back. And then we also have, for those of you who might, I know that you do a lot of social media work, so you might be interested in doing text analysis. We have one of the variables is called project description, in which we have taken an enormous amount of time to write out, on average, about 140 words, like a story of each project. And that's close to 2 million words total, which is like 19 full-length books. So in that spreadsheet, if you take that column out and start doing text analysis, you can find a lot. And we've done in our report, in the 5th section of the report, we have done quite a bit of that, where we did keyword searches on environmental hazard or corruption or things like that. So we are trying to improve that now with using machine learning, so that there is better analysis from that. But it's just, I think it's an enormous piece of information. So how do we do all of this, right? That's the big question. How do we know so much? The bottom line is, none of what we are doing is private. We are not collecting any or paying anybody to collect this data, except for our students who do this. So it's basically an open source methodology, which we call tracking underreported financial flows. I will spare you the details, but suffice to say that the sources of information come from, sometimes we get hold of original contracts for loans or grants that are signed, rescheduling that is done. A lot of times we get this from IMF missions in countries. Ministries of finance also provide these documents to us. But increasingly, a lot of this is also in reporting systems, MIS systems of developing countries, and they put this on their website. Sometimes we find them in budget documents. Much of this is also in the social media. So we basically cast a wide net and draw a lot of this information and then put it systematically. Also, you'll notice the Chinese embassies and MOFCOM's website has also started putting out a lot more information in the last 5 or 10 years. We have a total of 91,000 sources that we use to build this data. So about 7 sources per project. And I'm very proud to say that almost 90% of the projects have at least one official source that we can refer to. And all of these sources are the last 2 columns of the data set. So you can go and actually click around. Some of them are Dropbox links where we've saved a file and put it online. Many of them are just open source links that you can find. So a few high-level takeaways that you might be interested in. This is all I'm talking about, high-level findings, global level findings. I'll breeze through a few highlights, and then I'll share with you some charts on where Pakistan stands on this. And then I hope that we can have a little bit of an interactive session on the data itself. So first of all, during the BRI era, which Hussain, as Hussain mentioned, this started in 2013. So since 2013, our data finds that China is now outspending the US by a 2-to-1 basis, UK by more than a 7-to-1 basis. China is spending around $85 billion on this program. The US, for example, has hovered around 35-40 billion for several years now. So it's an orders of magnitude different scale, and this has ramped up significantly in recent years. The other interesting thing is that the ratio of OOF to ODA, remember OOF is loans and ODA is grants, is 9-to-1. So you can think of this as being like 80 to 90% of the portfolio that I'm talking about is basically lending, not traditional aid the way that we think of aid. So that's a very different model. And I think that's something that people, at least in Washington, it's hard for people to imagine the scale of this and the fact that this is slightly different. So a typical overseas loan from China is 4.5%, a 4.2% interest rate. But typical loans from Germany, France, or Japan, for example, will be hovering around 1.5% because they are highly subsidized. And I think you should, a lot of, when in the media coverage of this report, a lot of this was taken out of context, saying these are commercial rates or whatever. What you have to understand is that this is simply an artifact of the reality that China's going in much more risky environment. So anybody who's been in the banking business would know that if you are lending to somebody who's risky, you will want a greater return. China is going in riskier sectors. So if they are going in mining and stuff like that, the Japanese or the Germans will go in quote unquote more safe sectors, hiring a bridge or something simple like that. So this is not, you should not take this out of context. You should understand why this is happening. And we have a ton of data, and you can dig into this detail. As I said, every project has this information available. The other interesting thing is that there's rising levels of credit risk, as I said earlier, because Chinese mega projects and larger loans during the BRI, they're doing like much larger projects now. And what has happened is that, when you lend to somebody, you need a payment safeguard. So let's say I used to be a banker here in Standard Chartered. So if a small business comes to me and says, I want a loan, I would always ask for a collateral. Or collateral could be an asset, or it could be cash in their account against which I will lend. In this case, there's 3 forms of repayment safeguards that the Chinese are getting: collateral, credit insurance. So insurance is simply if Pakistan doesn't pay back, Sinosure will come and bail out the project, and they'll charge a premium for it, very much like you would take a loan on a house. And the third is a third-party repayment guarantee, whether that's a sovereign guarantee or something. So we've seen that in the last 20 years, the proportion of projects that have one of these mechanisms in place has gone up dramatically from 30 to 60%. So the Chinese are playing safe. They're very savvy, and they're making business deals, not giving out aids. And so our conclusion from this is that you should remember is that there is a lot of this, especially those of you who work in the foreign policy, national security space would think of, you must have heard about this debt trap narrative that the Chinese are here to give out loans and then they grab assets and go out. What we find in our data is that this is not the case. The BRI is basically an ecosystem under which a huge number of entities from within China, state entities, national entities, are working together as what we call the yield maximizing surrogates of the state. So they basically have money, they have excess dollars, and they want returns. So this is pure old capitalism at play. So that's something which I find quite fascinating. And you'll find this also in the CPEC case. A lot of the projects that have been financed through loan mechanism are those projects that create a revenue. So you put a power plant, you sell it to the government, you make a revenue. It's plain and simple that. Now, it's also very important for us to remember that not only is China out and helping developing countries with these infrastructure needs, it is also solving internal problems. So the two simple internal problems are, one, China has an excess supply of capacity on construction. So too much steel, too many companies putting bridges and tunnels, and they don't have enough projects at home to do anymore. So the logical thing to do is to export that capacity. Second, they have, as you know, they export so much to the world. They have trade surpluses and they have lots of dollars in euros. So if they start spending that money domestically, it creates fiscal imbalances, macroeconomic imbalances, could lead to inflation, blah, blah, blah. The bottom line is they're also looking for returns on that money. Before 2008, they would park all this cash into US Treasury. But as you know, in 2008, there was a massive global financial crisis. And the US government introduced what is called quantitative easing. Interest rates went down like they are right now. So they said, well, what do we do? We're going to look around the world and start putting. So you see a massive upsurge in spending by China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, which, by the way, are mandated by their government. It's a mission given to them. We have this money, go find good projects to fund. And so sometimes people forget that this is not a one-way street. It's a deal that has been made that both sides are benefiting from. By the way, if anybody has any questions, I think we're a small enough group. Hussain, will it be okay if people interrupted me? Raise your hand if you have anything, because I can go on for hours, but I would rather hear from you. If anything jumps out at you, please raise your hand and we can digress also. I absolutely no issues doing that. Now, let me also then skip some of this stuff, and I'll come to this issue that got a lot of media attention globally. When our report came out on the 29th of September, BBC did a report, and it was the most read story on BBC News for about 12 hours. Above Britney Spears getting free from her father, but then eventually it came below James Bond's new movie. So I'll tell you how much interest this generated. And the reason why it generated worldwide interest was this issue. One terminology that we used was the terminology of hidden debt. So that sort of implied that there is something sinister going on here, right? What we were explaining in our report was that we did a simple process. So once we had all this data, we figured out that there were a lot of public infrastructure spending being done in different countries. For example, the China-Laos rail project, almost $6 billion public infrastructure project, which is being presented to the Laotian people as a B2B, like business to business agreement. But the question is, if that project does not perform well, it does not create the returns that they expect, if that company that they've created a China-Laos railway company, a special purpose vehicle, what happens if that project fails? Is the Laotian government on the hook for repaying that? Are the Chinese lenders going to bail the project out? Will they grab the asset? What's going to happen? So that uncertainty is quite worrying for those of us who worry about macro things. So that kind of thing is happening quite a bit. So what we did was we collected all those kinds of projects, and then we compared it to the World Bank's debtor reporting system. So all countries since 1953 who are members of the World Bank give an accounting of their debt owed to all lenders to the World Bank. And then when we did that comparison, we found that there's $385 billion that is so-called missing. That's 5.8% of GDP for low and middle income countries. And that is the headline that got the most attention. And of course, in reality, not all countries are obligated to report to the World Bank. Venezuela, for example, doesn't have the best relationship with the World Bank. So Venezuela alone accounts for a large portion of this. In our data, we found Venezuela has taken on $90 billion of loans from China. But in the World Bank system, they've only reported 700 million, so less than $1 billion. So 90 out of this 385 is just from Venezuela. But that's what got the most attention. And I think if I remember correctly, in Pakistan, interestingly, it was the reverse, where our data had less and Pakistan had reported more to the World Bank. So Pakistan certainly does not have a hidden debt problem. If anything, our data is lagging what the government is already reporting. The problem with hidden debt, though, is, it's like what I call a phantom menace. It means that if you work in the Ministry of Finance, though some of you might have friends who work in the Ministry of Finance, the challenge is less about knowing that you will need to service some debt down the road, because you're always worrying about how much are my payment obligations. You want to make sure your government doesn't default. But what is more unsettling is, not knowing the monetary value of the debts that you owe to a country. So in a China-Laos example, do we owe this debt or we don't owe this debt? Should we take account for it or should we not? So I think that murkiness that has been created between public and private debt, that is the most interesting aspect of all of this. The other thing we found was from that text analysis that we did. So after we had put together all of those descriptions, we started doing some text analysis to search for keywords. And what we found was 35% of the BRI projects have some kind of problems. And the way we did it was we looked for keywords in there. We found problems like corruption scandals, like labor violations or environmental hazards or public protests. So these kinds of things are also happening a lot. And the public sentiment we also track in developing countries, there's a mixed bag. There's few countries like Zambia, DRC right now, where there is a lot of concern about this. And I think that what is happening is if I was in Beijing and talking to Chinese government counterparts, I would say that China has to address what we are looking from the data is a buyer's remorse problem. A lot of countries, signed up, raised their hands and said, let's do these projects. But 4, 5, 6 years down the road, when the payments become due, a lot of countries are having sort of second thoughts about, how are we going to pay this back? And COVID has made it even more difficult. Revenue streams are drying out. How are you going to pay back all this? So for China, they have to come up with some strategy to salvage the situation, so to speak. A few things I would say on Pakistan. Pakistan, as I said, is only one of the 165 countries in the data set. But thanks to our friends in Sama TV, we were able to, they helped pull this data viz together, which I think was quite fun. So this is basically on the x-axis shows the value in 2017 dollar terms of all Chinese development finance goes before CPEC was even a thing. And then on the y-axis, the values of transactions right here, and the x-axis are different years. So you'll see that in 2013-14, when CPEC was formally announced, when President Xi visited Pakistan in 2014, there was a massive increase. So if you look at this line in the middle, you see goes through the roof. So in the 2014 to 17 era, there was a lot. By the way, our data set only covers the period, the projects committed until 2017. Doesn't mean that we don't look at projects committed until 2017 and what happened to them since then, but we are lagging. We are still working on 2018, 19, 20. So hopefully every year from now on, we'll be putting out one additional year of data. Where does Pakistan stand? Again, this is according to our data set. The Chinese government officially doesn't report data on Belt and Road. Pakistan is number 7 on the list of loans, the amount of loans that we counted 27.8 billion already. Russia is very heavy on the top, and that's because they're doing a lot of oil pipelines and mining kind of work. Venezuela, Angola, Kazakhstan. Angola has a lot of natural resources. As far as ODA is concerned, which is your traditional aid, Pakistan also is in the top 10. Generally, the way we've understood this is the Chinese government likes to do ODA or loans for diplomatic reasons, for getting more influence, having friendly relations. They fund a lot of parliaments and stadiums and things like that, which happens in friendly governments. North Korea is very much on the top, but Pakistan also ranks very highly on that. So we are in the top 10 on both counts, which makes us probably the highest recipient of these projects overall, or Chinese funding overall, anywhere in the world. What has been funded according to our data? Not surprisingly, everybody already knows this. Almost 60% is just energy projects. These are all the power plants that were put, which help solve the energy crisis. The next biggest, again, not a surprise, is transportation. And then you see a lot smaller things, general budget support that comes through industry, mining, and construction. And I think in the next phase of the CPEC, you will see this sector, industry, mining, and construction, going up quite dramatically. And just to put this in perspective, if you look at just energy and transport, the teal color is energy and the red is transport. You'll see what I was talking about in terms of the massive upsurge. This area right here shows how much activity was ramped up 2013-14. The other thing I wanted to mention is we have extensive GIS data also, which I'll show you some examples. So all the projects that have any physical features, we have not only mapped, but we've also actually drawn on maps using OpenStreetMap, which you can download from GitHub and make maps and stuff. I've seen some very nice visualizations and data viz work that you guys have done recently. I was looking at your Twitter handle. I don't know who in the room here does it, but it's fantastic. So I think you guys can use much of that, because all of our projects are on the web. So if you want to represent CPEC projects, etc., this is just us doing it very, very quickly in like 10, 15 minutes. But you can imagine going deep into these areas just to give you a sense of what's happening. And then in terms of what has been funded, last thing I would say, I'm jumping from geography to financing. You see all this teal color here, the green. This shows this is all debt. So in the beginning, in the 2000s, even in 2008, there was a lot of growth on debt. But all of this area, when energy projects were coming on board, we've taken on a huge amount of debt in the last few years. I think that's all from my side. Hussain, the other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to show you our website a little bit and walk you through the data set and invite you to use it. I think we've put a lot of work in making everything accessible. And I think it's a good blueprint for us to follow and so on. But maybe I'll stop here and see if people have any questions. If not, then I'll just keep going.
I have a question.
Yes.
Of
course, please.
One of the projects that I worked on in the start, so I have some base level understanding of the issues that were there and still conversation around it. My key question to you is rather simple. There is a cultural difference in how the two worlds operate in terms of their development and their economics. The US, the Western Hemisphere, they have a particular way where there is
Sorry, I turned the mic off. Like all good academics would say, it depends. I think that, nobody can argue that in 2013, when I remember driving on this highway and in the main Faisal Avenue, it was all dark, right? Our industries were closed. Foreign direct investment was low. We had terrible insurgency going on in this country, people dying on the streets and so on. At that time, nobody was willing to invest in Pakistan. So did we need that energy, and did we need it quickly? Of course, yes. And if you remember, the 2013 elections were very much fought and won on this agenda. So it was the agenda of who's going to solve the power crisis. And so at that time, for the Chinese lenders, whether they came on the behest of the state or whatever it was, whether we were able to cajole them, we definitely needed that power. Of course, a cynic would say, or especially energy expert would say, oh, we should have also, as we were doing energy, we were massively expanding on energy capacity, we should have also reformed our energy sector, maybe decentralized it, maybe done something about line losses. But, I don't take, step into the shoes of a politician who's looking at an election cycle. This is much easier to do than trying to fix all those things, which we haven't solved in 60, 70 years. Look at Karachi Electric, for example. They've tried, they did some things well. It's very, very hard. So I think that if, let's say, we are able to make good use of this energy, for example, if this actually helps us become export competitive, if we can get our economy going, of course, this is a good investment if we can keep paying back. But there's also risks. Because remember that a lot of these or all of these loans are foreign currency denominated. So when your rupee devaluates, all things equal, you have to pay more in dollar terms. So it's a very big problem, especially when your economic situation is not stable. So it's a risk, I think. So it's a double-edged sword. A lot of these countries do need this infrastructure, absolutely no doubt. But Hussain, what you were saying earlier, I think it definitely represents a different worldview. I don't think anybody's used this terminology, but I think it's a model, a Chinese model of development that is being adopted here, which is very much what I think is supply driven. You provide, the philosophy is you provide the infrastructure, you get industry going, you generate economic activity, and other things will happen from it. And it is also very attractive to recipient governments, not just Pakistan, but all countries which have elections, because it's quick, it is visible, you can see it, it's all over the place, it's in your face, and it can also benefit your population. So if you compare the US and Chinese spending in the last 20 years, the largest US sectors are social sectors, health and education and stuff. China does a lot of those projects, but they do a number of very small projects. So you look at our data set, we have, I think, 228 Pakistan projects. I think a third of them will be health, another third will be education, but their amounts are very small as compared to like 1.6 billion for the metro in Lahore. These are smaller projects. So who am I to say what has better impact or not? Of course, we need everything. We need a bit of everything, but I think really depends on how we make use of it. Last thing I'll say on this is my worry with the special economic zones is that unless we get all of these other ingredients that go into getting a special economic zone going, we will not be able to make use of it. So it's a tremendous opportunity. Don't get me wrong, but a lot of other hard work has to be done by us. We should not expect others to come and do this, because if Huawei or some companies investing in Rashakai or someplace, they need not just land and gas and electricity. Of course, they need that. They also need manpower. They also need supply chains. They need connectivity. Because at the end of all of this, in the second phase of the CPEC, I think it would be a failure in my mind if we cannot create 10, 15, 20 Pakistani companies that are on the global map and they can export by themselves. Yes, I know there's going to be a lot of outsourcing of construction, outsourcing of manufacturing from China, because that's more expensive, we are cheaper. But even for that to happen, we need to get our people trained up today for industries that will come 5 years from now. So, sorry, long answer, but it's complicated. As far as the neo-colonialism thing is concerned, I think you're right that there is definitely jitteriness in Washington. People worry about this. There's a lot of myths also, but I think I said this in the beginning of my talk. These, for the large, from what I can tell, this is yield maximizing. These are yield maximizing surrogates of the state who are here to make a profit. It's plain and simple like that. So I think that, yes, there might be some element to truth to this, especially if those of you who follow 5G and the war of standards and Huawei, you might think that yes, 5G is going to be the future, so they want to invest in their standards. Right now, we all follow the West's standards. We speak their language, we follow their miles and kilometers or their standards. I think that battle is definitely being fought. But to me, at the moment, from the data that I can see to your answer, I don't see this whole debt trap diplomacy having much actual evidence in the actual support in the evidence. Other people will make their own conclusions, which is what scholarship is about at the end of the day. On the US response, I think this administration has, if you go to the White House's website in June 21st of this year, they put out a statement called after the G7 summit in the UK, which basically said we are going to start a new initiative that you mentioned, Build Back Better World, and they lay out some framework around it. And the basic principles are, we will do values-based lending. We will not fund dirty projects, which are like coal projects, which cause the damage to the environment. We'll prioritize human rights, all the typical liberal values system that the West believes in and wants to export. And I think that's very, very clear in the Build Back Better initiative. The one thing they mentioned on the financing, they said that they rightly identify, I think, that for them, the greatest strength is their private sector and the innovation that their private sector brings. And they think that instead of doing a dollar-to-dollar match for what China is doing, because I don't think that any of the G7 countries can even afford to do this, anymore. So they're in their mind, the strategy is, let's identify a few sectors where we have a competitive advantage and then lead with that. And that we will stimulate private sector financing from the US private sector. Wall Street has a lot of money also, you're talking about $85 billion, some of the companies that we have in the US and the size of the Wall Street is very large. So I think they could stimulate private sector financing, but on what terms? What is going to be the detail? Who's going to do all this bidding? All of that is yet to be seen. In fact, I would want to learn from you all, because there's a lot of talk of inviting the Americans and others to join CPEC. There's talk of CPEC Plus in Afghanistan. I don't know how that might play out and whether it's in their interest. At the end of the day, they'll do what's in their interest. But it's definitely, I feel like being in Washington and talking to people, I think that people have rolled up their sleeves and there's going to be some kind of quote unquote strategic competition. What forms it takes, I think it's in our lifetimes, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. So I hope that I will never be out of a job, with this line of research. That's my bet. Sorry, Uday, Kashun, you had a question and there's another question. You want to go first, Kashun?
Just echoing what you just said about debt trap and just contradicting the myths already established about PRI and CPAC. So building on that, you mentioned something I was very fascinated how you mentioned that debt trap is not really evidence-backed. And China in financing projects is like a pure form of capitalism. So one, we have like two models, different models that actually work. So one is the Chinese model, as you said, there's a state that wants to invest in finance projects. That's clearly not capitalism. There's government intervention. So, and there's a US model which is stimulating.
you might think that people like me get hung up on on terminology, but it's important. So ODA, if you look at the OECD's website, we are not making our own assessments. We are simply using what the OECD has used as the definition of what is ODA and what is OF. And then we try to see every project that we see and make a judgment on what that is. So for something to be classified as ODA, it has to be highly concessional. So concessional means if it was going to be, if you would go to Citibank and take a line of credit, like we just got some money from Saudi Arabia, for example, right? If you went to Goldman Sachs or Citibank and say we need a line of credit, what would be the expense of that? What would be the net present value of that? And then you compare it to what you're getting from anyone else, like the Saudis or somebody else. And if the gap between those two or the concessionality is greater than 25%, only that's one criteria, concessional. And there's a grant element calculator on OECD's website where you can enter any loan terms and it'll tell you how concessional it is as compared to commercial rates. And second is it has to be for developmental objectives. And third is it has to be in a country which is ODA eligible, which is based on your income level. So Saudi Arabia, for example, giving Oman $1 billion like they gave us is never going to be ODA because Oman is not ODA eligible. We are, right? So I haven't looked at exactly what the terms are, but from what I know from this recent thing, but generally speaking, as I said, if it's concessional, if the line of credit is cheaper than what you would get on the market by 25%, if the intent is developmental. So of course, budget support to a government of Pakistan, maybe I think they would consider it developmental because it's for development objectives. I don't know exactly, but I think we should be able to find out how this is done.
The second point, concessional, but developmental, isn't that arguable? Couldn't it be?
Yeah, there are some. Yeah, I'll show you my spreadsheet, and we have written out the definitions from the OECD's website on what this means. But of course, like everything else, it's open to interpretation. So this is, and again, to what you were saying, Kashun, about capitalism and this and that. I think this connects with that also, because a lot of these entities the Chinese entities that are coming in and giving out loans, these entities are state-owned commercial banks. So they are commercial banks, like ICBC is a commercial bank, but they are state-owned. Now, some people have pushed back already on us and said, well, the entire Chinese state, the entire Chinese financial banking system should be considered state-owned, right? Because there's no private ownership of anything, right? So those are debates that we often have, but I think you're right that there are two distinct models, the Chinese and the US model. And I think for us as developing countries, the decision is, what is in your best interest? How are you going to make use of it? What is going to be the return from it, and so on. And to your other point about local businesses, I as I was saying earlier, I think it would be very unfortunate if we can't create through CPEC the ability in Pakistani firms to be internationally competitive. There are a few sectors where we are still internationally competitive, but if you compare to our neighbors, Pakistan's export competitiveness has been coming down dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. So is this injection of capital is great. I think we also need injection of knowledge, knowledge, and how to do business. And I think local institutions here, we have SAMEDA in the Punjab, based in Lahore, Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority. We have technical vocational institutions. And I know from the CPEC authority that they're making a lot of efforts with the new special economic zones to create the human capital. They're trying to anticipate the needs 5 years out and trying to create human capital today. And I think unless these local Pakistani firms are integrated into the value chains, because every product has a value chain. So think of this iPhone, there's all these reports of how many countries and how many factories produce small little chips that go into your iPhone. That is value chain. So we need to get our local businesses into those value chains. And that cannot happen just by injection of capital. It has to happen by a lot of other factors that I don't really see happening at the moment. But you're pointing your finger in the right direction. And that's where we need to focus on for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned outsourcing manufacturing capacity for the Chinese. And I think that's pretty much the standard rationale that the Communist Party of China has been quoting. From a Chinese perspective, given China's economic success, it's also important for the Chinese to focus on residents in Xinjiang as well. they want to make sure that the western flank of their country is developed to a large extent. I have two questions. One is related to this, and one is related to the BCIM corridor. Can you make any sort of comparative analysis between the BCIM and CPEC, whether some
Sorry, what is the BCIM?
The Bangladesh, China,
Oh, I see.
India, Myanmar corridor? It's also part of the BRI.
I honestly don't know much about the BCIM, but I can tell you from, as I think I mentioned this earlier, CPEC is by far one of the biggest corridor the Chinese have funded. There's many pieces of evidence that indicate that it is very close to their hearts. They want to make it successful. It's a flagship of the Belt and Road. So I cannot imagine. I can get back to you on the BCIM, and we can even, in fact, this is a good segue to our next thing where we can search in our data set and you can find out. But it's also, I don't have the depth of understanding to comment on whether BCIM is successful or not. I do think that it cannot be bigger or more salient than the CPEC for sure, because it's obviously the regional dynamic is quite different over there. On the Xinjiang thing, I think I've heard this also, to be honest. And I also know from some work I've seen the World Bank do on this grand idea of there's also documentaries on this now, on the connectivity from Western China to Europe through Central Asia. They have invested in rails, so that part, leave alone CPEC, that part is coming together. And I think the idea from a grand strategy point of view makes sense, where from Western China you have a closest access to the Persian Gulf, warm waters through Pakistan, and then through Western Europe, because they don't then have to send their goods from the eastern part of China all the way around Africa and Asia. So I think that story makes sense, but to be honest, I haven't systematically looked at the data from that lens yet. But I think it would make for a fascinating. Maybe you and I could write a paper on this.
Because that's how the Chinese think of it.
Yeah. So if I may, before we run out of time, we have like 5 or 7 minutes left. I know you have a question. I'll take your question, then I'll quickly show you some of the things in the data set from the website before I go, and I want to end it at 1 o'clock.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. One, basically on the point that Hamza was alluding to concerning the China economic project. As far as the government of Myanmar is concerned, based on our interaction that we had back in 2019, one of their government think tanks, was that a lot of their interaction in terms of engagement on projects was being taken on a project-to-project basis and have a more broad-based cooperation with China.
Absolutely. I think for the business case for that has to be made. And I think the point I'm making is you're absolutely right. It is incumbent on us to do this. China is not going to come and do it for us. We have to get our act together ourselves and do it. It's an opportunity like probably never before in our lifetimes. And on China, Myanmar, one thing I've seen in my data is, generally speaking, basically the Chinese approach is, because they don't do what Hussein was saying about the cultural difference, they're not coming in with presupposed values on or judgments are like, this is what we'll do and this is not. They're not coming in with conditionalities for the most part. Basically they're coming, so for example, they go and say, I can imagine two people sitting and talking about this, like there's a menu of options. You want hydropower, you'll get hydropower, this is the price tag for this. You want coal, this is the coal. And their guiding principle is that we will follow whatever are the local regulations and the local laws and rules about environmental safeguards. So I think that's pretty obvious, and that makes it easier for them to engage with countries. And also, I would say that this is a good occasion for me to introduce the website. So if you go to china.aidata.org, and just as you were talking, I searched for Myanmar, and I found that we have 291 projects from Myanmar. So, for example, Embassy of China in Myanmar donates books to International School of Myanmar 2016. This is probably a grant. And then there's dormitory building they've funded. Whenever you see Chinese embassy, these are mostly grants. And I'm sure if you knew the name of the dam and search for it, chances are you'll find it in our data set. So for each of these projects then, and you click on it, I already have one open. This is for Port Qasim. For each and every one of the projects, it shows you where it is located. This is all on the web. So if you zoom out, it will tell you exactly where the plant is to the best of our knowledge. It'll tell you what the commitment amount is, who's funding it. This is the energy sector code from OECD. It's a loan, it's concessional, yes. How much concessional, you'll have to go to the spreadsheet to find out and tell you what the intent is. We talked about what's development and what's not. So this is mixed intent. This comes in other official flows. This tells you what the status is, where the project stands. Status is completed. Commitment year is 2015. It was completed in 2018. And then there's all this, who are the receiving agencies? Port Qasim Electric Company, was a joint vehicle that was created. And here are all the Chinese entities that participated in this. The maturity is 14 years, the interest rate is 4.1%. And if you want to get into the sources, we have 18 sources, 8 unofficial and 18 official and 8 unofficial. You can download the data set and get into the detail. And these are the descriptions I was discussing where we did the text analysis. So it's basically a story of the project. And you can imagine how much work this has taken to pull this together for thousands and thousands of projects, which is why I'm emphasizing this, that I would love for people like you to use this resource. And if you find any discrepancies, anything, we're very open to engaging with you. I'll leave my contact information, and I would love for you guys. So if you're interested, for example, in Myanmar, why don't you dig into this and see what we have? And then the other thing that I'm also very proud of is that I mentioned the tracking underreported financial flows methodology. Here, we have a summary of the methodology. What are the features of it? And then we have all of the methodology documents from the last 10 years, how our methodology has improved. So we've come from a very basic 1.0 methodology, which was completely media-based, to today 2.0, where we'll give you with our data set this gigantic, I would say about 100-page document, where we've given in fine detail exactly how we collected the data. So, how do we capture it? How do we define it? Who are the different players? What are the assumptions that we have made for each and every one of them? And even all the definitions, the classifications and everything. So I don't expect senior policymakers to have the time to dig into this, but those of you who live in this world, I think it's in your interest to try to figure things out on your own. Like, for example, this grant element calculator, concessionality, and so on. And also, this is where you download the data set. It's on our website. It's a simple simple spreadsheet that I can just quickly show you how it looks like. Maybe, Hussein, can I go on for a couple more minutes just to finish this up? Thank you. Yeah, okay. I'll show you this. these things. We have definitions of all of these things. What is concessional mean? What is flow type? How do we get sector codes? And then we have, this is what the data set actually looks like. So all of these, each of these rows are a single project. There are about 70 variables here, and you can sort them. You can focus on them. And what I do, generally speaking, is I would just do a pivot table, for example, like so I do a pivot table and I just extract different variables out of it as to what I'm interested in. The two other things some of you might be interested in, we have a separate tab here for military. So we've put military in a completely separate category. And then we also, within our team, there was discussion on where we would want to classify Huawei. So we put it as its own tab. So you can make your own judgment on whether Huawei is government, not government, whatever. We don't get into that debate. But there are like hundreds and hundreds, like 1,500 Huawei projects. And if you search for the term 5G, you will find quite a number of 5G projects. So you can tell exactly where 5G projects are being implemented and so on. So again, it's a resource for you to use. And I would be happiest if some of you decide to use this data. And if you need any questions answered, if you're confused, if you want to learn how to use it more, I'm very happy to jump on a Zoom call and walk you through it. We have research assistants and others who worked on this data, which can also help with technical issues. If you want to move this to Stata and you can't do it, if you want to do GIS, you can't do it, anything like that. But please use this resource. I think it's a public good as I see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I think it's a very enlightening discussion.